Okay, and our final presenter of the day is Clara Bradford, who is the National Adoption Manager for MLA. Clara currently resides in Young, having completed a Bachelor of Animal Science here, also a member of the meat judging cult, and has also done some fairly impressive work in terms of representing her country in meat judging, and also been lucky enough to work up in the territory for AACO. She's been with MLA since 2016 when she started as a sheep genetics land plant development officer, and in 2018 she took on the role of National Adoption Manager with MLA, a role that she will put on hiatus in 2 months? 2 months. Okay, so we've got it for 2 months. Let's make the most of it, and we're going to hear today about the MLA genetics campaign. Ladies and gentlemen, Clara Bradford.
Thanks, Luke. Can you hear me all right? Yep. All right. So, yes, I'm going to talk today about the genetics adoption activities that we've been doing the last 2 years. So in Leading Breeder 2019, I actually presented on some of the things that we were about to start doing. So I'm really excited that we're now able to, report back and talk about what we've delivered, how did some of that go, and also what are we up to in the next little while as well. So if I just touch on what we've delivered, I'll do a little bit of a recap of what I presented at Leading Breeder, how we're driving adoption, and about our genetics campaign. So funnily enough, at Leading Breeder 2019, I actually stood up in front of everyone and talked about the adoption process of taking a selfie. 2 years on, I didn't think that that photo would actually be quite nostalgic, where there I was in a room with 180 delegates being able to present face to face, and what quite a different scenario we are actually in today. So I look back on that and think, well, what a great process that was to go through, and how that is still quite relevant in terms of how we're communicating with each other and how we're interacting with each other. So it's really great that we can utilise the modern technology now and actually have some of you in the room, some of you online. And so I encourage you all in the process of this talk to take a selfie and put it on social media, #LeadingBreeder, and add to the collection of how we're communicating with each other as a whole. So along those lines also at Leading Breeder, I presented on what our adoption strategy is and is going to be over the next couple of years. So the key pillars of that was really around how we're demonstrating value and growing demand for breeding values, what our pathway to learning is, so making sure that we have all the education opportunities right from awareness all the way through to longer term learning. Simplifying the language and tools. It might be very simple for, or it might be second nature for leading breeders who have been doing this for quite some time, but it can be quite challenging for somebody new or a commercial producer who's seeing these things for the first time. And then the last part is really the keystone of what we're doing at MLA, is making sure that we're aligning our adoption activities with any R&D that's coming through. And the National Livestock Genetics Consortium gives us a real good ability to do that. So we've delivered lots of different things across all of these different pillars, and I'll just go through some of those. So the first one is around demonstrating value. So we actually delivered a marketing campaign, which was a really interesting process to go through, trying to make genetics and ASBVs look sexy, but it was pretty fun at the same time. Also with Pathway to Learning, we've run lots of different extension groups and activities and trying to build up the network of people that are engaging with our materials and engaging in our education processes, because we had a challenge with the different styles of languages and all the different information that was going out around genetics, and we wanted to streamline that. So over the last 2 years, we've delivered workshops with elders. We've developed a Beef Champions network, which is similar to our sheep genetics service provider network. We've also brought together our leading end of genetics people. So we've got sheep genetics, our beef experts, DPI, all coming together in an extension group to work on how we best deliver some of the new genetics R&D, and then also we've built the new genetics hub, which I'll go through in a bit further. In terms of simplifying the language and tools, the redevelopment of the sheep genetics website was a big part of that, and we spent a lot of time doing some research with lots of different users, both commercial and seed stock, to work through that process. One of the most interesting parts of that project was it wasn't necessarily about changing the language, rather it was about how do we support or provide context to the current language that we already have. So that was a good finding for us and shaped the way we built that new website. Then also in beef, we have the Desirable project, which is very similar to Ram Select. And then further, doing lots of longer term learning style activities. So we had producer demonstration sites developed for the first time in genetics for a long time. We've had new breeding values come available to be used by producers, and then also building adoption strategies into our programs. So just on the marketing campaign, this was released in August 2019, and it was the title was Accelerate Your Productivity with Genetics, and part of that was a full-blown process of bringing lots and lots of communications, resources, new things that we'd developed all together and presenting it in a form or a package, which we essentially call a campaign. And so part of that was we had a website that was the centre of the campaign we called the Genetics Hub. We then had all of the different mediums and information going out in different places, so digital, print, case studies, new videos, feedback magazine, you name it, we tried it, and we put it in as many places as we possibly could. So a highlight of that campaign was not telling people you need to use breeding values, but actually talking about how genetics plays a role in their businesses to improve productivity and focusing on that productivity message at a commercial level. And so all of our case studies are all commercial producers. They've used genetics tools and technologies, they've recorded information on their productivity, and they can demonstrate how that has contributed to their improvement on farm. So it's all well and good to release a campaign and all this new information, but is it actually a really good way to communicate with producers? That we didn't know. And so we wanted to make sure that we actually did our market research on that process to make sure that those new communication resources were doing what they were intended to do, and also making sure that it was a good way to communicate with a commercial producer audience. So just initial engagement or stats that we could collect without going through market research. 50 stakeholders actively shared the content. So that's everything from breed societies, departments, leading breeders, all lots of different organisations. And they were actively coming to us asking for, can I have this information? Can I share it? Can we use it? Can we print this? Can we have that? So it was really good to have such a strong engagement from lots of our other organisations that are involved around genetics and genetic evaluations. In terms of the website, the first year we had 10,000 visitors and 10,000 video views. Since then, to date, we've doubled that, so it's 20,000 visitors and 20,000 video views. And 3.5-minute watch time basically means that people are going on there and watching at least one of the videos for the full length of the video, because that's about how long they are. So that was really good initial information for us to say, is this actually working or not? But then if we're to go through the market research process, so we actually employed a company to ring some breeders and ask some questions. So we rang 600 breeders, 600 producers, 300 sheep and 300 beef. And we split this into 3 different components. The first thing we asked was a couple of questions around what are your genetic practices? And these followed along the lines of the same questions we asked for a broader survey back in 2016. And then the second part was that we asked questions around the actual information that we delivered. And then lastly, we asked around how people like to receive communications. So just going through the genetics practices, one of the questions we asked is, what do you use genetic tools in your business? And as Hamish said before, it was really promising to see that close to 50% of producers said that they are using ASBVs or EBVs in their business, which was a real highlight for us, considering our 2016 result was closer to 20%. Some of the reasons that people mentioned, well, I don't use breeding values, was because they have a small operation, they're happy with how they're currently going. One of the interesting ones here, I think, that I wanted to highlight is that they rely on their seed stock producer, which I think is a fair reason, saying, well, you know, I can actually go to my seed stock producer and say, it's your job to do the selection part, just give me the best ones you got. So I think, but the other pleasing part about it was that we set out to help distill the information to make sure that it wasn't too complex or sophisticated, and that result there is actually now quite low compared to what it was a few years ago. So it's starting to demonstrate already in the initial stages of the research that some of the stuff we were doing was working. We also then asked around, okay, what are the attitudes towards breeding values? And a lot of people said, yes, we can see it'll have a benefit to our business, but I'm not really concerned about the cost of implementing it. I agree with that, because for commercial producers, all it requires them is to buy a ram or a bull, which they have to do anyway. But they still want to see a value proposition. And so some of that information helps inform what do we do next in terms of trying to help people understand the benefits of breeding values. In relation to campaign assessment, we asked people cold turkey, have you seen any of the MLA genetics resources? And 30% of people said yes. So then what we did is we prompted them with some of the different things that we had delivered, and 80% of people then came back and said, oh, actually, I do remember something about the campaign. And so that's really good quality information for MLA as a whole, because one of the things we did was we used an information from another survey that MLA had done around how producers like to receive information. And this lined up really well with that in terms of we were communicating in the right ways with the right mediums. So this sort of demonstrates that. So we can see print media is still the most popular. So most people want a magazine or a newspaper or read it in Friday feedback, or they want to see the collateral that was developed as print. So feature articles, producer case studies, promotions. The website stuff obviously then tails off towards the end. But I think what this really demonstrates is that we use multiple mediums to capture a broader audience. So we're using stuff that people from lots of different backgrounds and understandings, ages, where their businesses are up to, they use one form of at least some of this. So that's why the campaign actually had so much success. So the other thing that we asked is, okay, you've seen all this information, what are you actually going to do now that you've seen the information? So what was the call to action? And these are the top ones. So it's really pleasing to see that a lot of people, it started the conversation. So they started asking other breeders, other producers about breeding values. They also developed a breeding objective. And then thirdly they've asked questions about existing or potential size of their studs. So they're going to the people that they know and they're starting to ask questions about it. Further on, they then used breeding values and visited the relevant sites or contacted the relevant organisations for more assistance. The other thing we asked around was we really wanted to know, well, did we actually make it simple for you? Was it an easier way to understand that information? So I was really happy to see that the material was clear and easy to understand, and the information was helping people utilise breeding values all the way through to actually people wanting to seek further learning, which is really what we wanted to see. One of the other things we looked at was what about the way we communicate with our audience. So this graph really stood out in terms of when we were going through the results, and we also asked this question back in 2016 of that other survey that we did. And you can see there that when people go to ask for advice around, so this question was where do you go to seek advice around genetics and genetic information? There's so many different sources. There's so many different people that are experts in the field. But pleasingly enough in sheep, there's actually a trend in some key places where people seek information. And one of the things I really wanted to highlight here was that we've seen a much higher increase in commercial producers going to their studs or their breeder to seek information, and also from their consultants or advisors. The agents, although really strong still, that has actually decreased since 2016. And then also it's good to see that some key organisations are playing a role within that as well. So from the campaign research, I guess there were a few key take-home messages. Firstly, that what the activities and information we had provided had helped increase the use of breeding values in commercial industry. The materials and information that we developed were easy to understand and help simplify the information that's being provided. Providing a campaign approach where we collect all the information up and pump it out through multiple channels was a really effective way of delivering that information to a commercial audience. And then the research that we did actually helped us inform, okay, what's the new activity that we're going to move forward with? So if we talk about, we've got this really good research that we've done now, and actually one of the really good things that came out of that is MLA is using campaign approach for other topics now. You may have actually seen that we have a soils hub that's come out, and we've got information coming out around soils, feed base and persistence of pastures, delivering it in a very similar way because of how the genetics campaign actually went. So it's been quite a valuable process to go through that market research path. So what's coming up next? We still have to fill some education gaps. We have some current projects underway, and also just want to touch on the role of you as breeders. So in terms of education, we still, although we've got these new awareness, what we would call resources, we still have a few other places that we need to fill the gaps essentially. So one of those is we're building some e-module resources, and these will be focused at advisors such as agents, our consultants, and also leading breeders will have the opportunity to do these as well. These will be developed with the University of New England, and they'll also have the opportunity to contribute to education and training points for those external advisors. And they will essentially focus on around the key elements of genetic evaluations and also how to implement genetics into breeding programs. Secondly, we're currently going through the process of updating the Bredwell-Fedwell workshops. They've been very successful and run over many years. However, some of the course material is now 10 years old, particularly in the sheep space. We've seen lots of information delivered today about the improvement to our reproduction analysis and how we're using those breeding values. We need to make sure that those commercial packages align with that. So Bredwell-Fedwell is going under an update. And the other thing that we're going to introduce is we've had a breeding course running in Northern Australia for quite some time now, and we actually want to replicate that and bring that down south for southern sheep and beef producers. So that's also happening in the background as well. We also recognise that a lot of what we've delivered so far is all been awareness, and it's all well and good to see some materials, but does that actually translate into people changing the way that they operate or changing their practices? And so part of that is providing opportunities for people to learn more and get a bit practical. So we want to increase the amount of genetics demonstration sites that we're doing. We're looking at more longer term learning opportunities through our programs such as profitable grazing systems. And then also developing up customised projects to tackle specific problems. So a really good example of that has been the sheep merino-linked DNA stimulation project that's engaged lots of breeders across Australia to help increase the use of DNA technologies. So we hope to do more projects like that over the coming years. So the last thing I just wanted to touch on is the role of breeders through this process. So one of the things that was pretty clear from the market research is that, you as breeders are a learning resource for commercial producers. And I think it's a really good thing that sheep genetics has worked so strongly with our leading breeders to put you in a place where that you can communicate around genetics effectively to your commercial clients. So I encourage you all to use the opportunities that are available to you to learn more and become experts in the field of genetics because you all love breeding sheep. And then sharing that knowledge with your commercial clients. Use the resources that are there available for you that have been developed. And the other thing is there is a great support network, particularly in sheep, around supporting you to then support your commercial client. Use the sheep genetics team, use the resources that are available to you, use the service providers we've spent training to be able to support you to do that. So essentially you're an integral part of the delivery of knowledge and transfer of genetic tools and technologies, and please don't forget that. And that's me.
Thanks, Clara. Some really interesting numbers in that talk. I think the real big one for me was that part that you highlighted, the role of breeders in terms of that first port of call for the next question, which for producers, which makes events like this and our other training events around the sheep genetics so important. We'll go to these questions now. So I'll go through from the bottom up. So the future of the genetics hub, are we going to do? Is there another campaign in the books prior to sales season?
Yeah. So at this stage, so in last year, 2020, we released a smaller version of the campaign where we had new resources. So some of the feedback from the market research was actually that people wanted some more specific information on traits. So we developed a whole suite of trait videos which are now available. The next step of that is that we're working through developing some new case studies from producers, and it'll be case study focused, the next part that we release. The hope is, rather than now having a campaign approach, is that those resources become key essential pieces or backbone information that is now used for lots of different education processes and programs. So the short answer is probably not really. Are we going to do another full-blown campaign? But it will be complemented in other ways.
Okay, next question. Following on from the campaign, and obviously we saw sheep things because we are at a sheep event, but did you see similar impacts of the campaign in beef, or is sheep leading the beef industry once again? Okay, good question. So yes, we did see similar impacts in beef. One of the things we were able to do is separate out by state and also separate out by temperate or tropical beef. And obviously we still have some gaps in the marketplace in tropical beef stands out. And we've known that for quite some time, and certainly have some projects directed particularly at that sector of the industry. I think the other thing is really around that where we go to for resource, for advice was really different between beef and sheep. For beef, it was very varied. It was all over the place. There was no consistency really in where people seek information around genetic evaluations or genetics in general. And that's generally because there's a lot more players in the pipeline for beef than there is in sheep. So I think from seed stock producers providing advice to their commercial clients and being a resource, that really stood out as an advantage of the sheep space. And I think that's because we all work so closely together, and I guess gives us a bit of a pat on the back for that. And final question, so obviously Bred Well and Fed Well update and the Southern Breeding Course, are they going to be supported with a Southern Nutrition Edge? At this stage, the answer would be no. Nutrition is generally tried to be covered in other ways, particularly because it's very specific to the region that you live in down south, whereas northern nutrition advice is pretty standard across quite a large area. However, there are unique programs that are being regionalised to cover off on nutrition. So it might not look like Nutrition Edge, but certainly there'll be opportunities to learn more about nutrition. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Clara.